It took me until I became an MP to realise that I was unemployable. And to a certain extent, it means that I am, it was kind of inevitable that I'd be fired for some of these jobs, which is odd when you consider that as a barrister, you're self-employed. And in some ways, I shouldn't have been fired by the barristers' chambers because I was actually quite a good barrister. But I just didn't get on with one or two senior members of the chambers. I'd sort of behaved badly in their view. And they thought I'd be a risk, a gamble. I'd screw up in some spectacular way.
This is The Longest Day, an Uncharted Way. I'm Leah Brown FRSA, your host, and this podcast is brought to you by the Wayfinders Group, a consultancy that supports leaders with board governance one conversation at a time, preserving relationships, mitigating risk, and improving effectiveness. The world feels more complicated than ever, and we have such high expectations for people at the top. Leadership certainly isn't for the faint-hearted. You've got to ask the right questions, empower your people, and remain calm in the midst of a storm. This podcast showcases a series of conversations where leaders have taken an uncharted way. As they share their longest days, we get to learn from their resilience, determination, and candor, and marvel at how they navigated uncharted territory. Our hope is that their stories will empower you to look forward and unearth opportunities for you to harness personal growth and transformation. Ed Vaizey is a member of the House of Lords, a business advisor, broadcaster, speaker, and event host. Ed was the Member of Parliament for Wantage between 2005 and 2019. He served as the UK Government Culture and Digital Minister from 2010 to 2016 and is the longest-serving minister in that role. He was appointed as a Privy Councillor in 2016. In his role as Digital Minister, Ed was responsible for the rollout of the successful rural broadband programme to more than 4 million homes, the introduction of 4G, and tax credits for film, television, animation, and video games, which helped make the creative industries the fastest-growing part of the UK economy. Ed also helped persuade Lucasfilms to make the new Star Wars in the UK and received a credit in the first film of the series. He published the first white paper on culture for 50 years in 2016. As well as his work in the House of Lords, Ed advises a number of companies on strategic issues. He's a well-known broadcaster with a show on Times Radio and regularly contributes to the media. Ed is a trustee of Tate, chairman of the UK ASEAN Business Council, an honorary fellow of the Radio Academy, and has an honorary degree from Newcastle University, where he is a visiting professor. Well, Ed, thank you very much for being willing to come on the Longest Day podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Perhaps you might like to tell our listeners about your longest day.
What, just like that? What was my longest day?
Just like that.
Getting fired is always a good story. And it was a very long day. So I was working for a political consultancy, and I'm a bit of a maverick. I wasn't really a very 9-to-5 guy. I could sense that they weren't particularly happy with me. I went to see Chelsea play Stuttgart in the European Cup Winners' Cup in Stockholm in Sweden. And we won the European Cup Winners' Cup. It probably was about 1998. And it turned into a very long day because we were kettled as obviously very violent Chelsea fans at the airport. And we were eventually let on the plane once all our knives had been taken away from us and chains and things. And we landed at Heathrow and I hadn't slept. So I came home and I rang the office of the consultancy I was working at and I said, I'm so sorry, I'm not feeling very well. I'm not coming in today. And then my favourite client rang me and said, you've got to go into the office because they want to fire you. So I went into the office and they fired me. And one of them is now in the House of Lords with me, one of the guys that fired me. And the other one just texted me asking me to come and have lunch with him. But I'll never forget it. I think it's probably the third time I've been fired. And anyway, the client who rang me and told me I was going to get fired was being helpful because he said, you can go and work for my PR company and you can then carry on working for me. I ended up carrying on working for the client and building my own little public affairs practice within this PR company. So that was a very long day. Getting fired, having not slept, having watched Chelsea win at football. The guy I was working for in a public affairs company said, you're a Tory and Labour have just won a landslide election. I don't think you're going to be much use to me. You're fired. But that came after my ignominious career at the bar, where I was a pupil barrister. And at the end of my pupillage, all the pupil barristers were being assessed as to whether they should be taken on in chambers. And I had had various scrapes, including being told off by a judge for eating sweets in court behind my pupil master. So it was no surprise when they turned around to me and said, you know what, you're fired.
And yet it seems to have absolutely no impact on your career. I suppose my question for you is this. In each of those instances, do you believe that you ought to have been fired?
It took me until I became an MP to realise that I was unemployable. And to a certain extent, it means that I am, it was kind of inevitable I'd be fired for some of these jobs, which is odd when you consider that as a barrister, you're self-employed. And in some ways, I shouldn't have been fired by the barristers' chambers because I was actually quite a good barrister. But I just didn't get on with one or two senior members of the chambers. I'd sort of behaved badly in their view. And they thought I'd be a risk, a gamble. I'd screw up in some spectacular way. But I actually think if they'd taken me on, I would have probably thrived at those chambers and done very well. So I feel a bit miffed about that because as a barrister, you're self-employed. But I think one of the reasons I behaved so badly was because actually being a barrister is extraordinarily dull. You're basically in your room all day writing essays, which is not something I enjoyed. And so it's quite an isolated and quite a pompous profession. The two lobbying firms that fired me probably should have fired me because I'm not a 9-to-5, and I survived at the PR company that I ended up at. I survived because I was sort of boss within a boss. So I ran my own team. I was pretty autonomous. I did public affairs. The rest of the firm did public relations. So there was a bit of an overlap in what we did, which kind of helped the business. But I could run my own show pretty much. I could employ who I wanted and so on. So in that sense, but any kind of attempt to impose authority on me or make me do 9-to-5 never worked. So I don't know whether I should ever have been an entrepreneur, but I think that my people management skills are non-existent. So that would have been very difficult because I wouldn't have had the slightest interest in the people that I employed. So once I became an MP and it was just me and my constituents, and obviously I had a small team in my office, it was so much easier. And also weirdly being a minister, which in some ways is 9-to-5, but at least you are very much your own boss as a minister. You set the agenda, you decide what's important, you decide broadly speaking what issues you're going to work on. And I think now that I'm in the House of Lords and I have a sort of self-employed portfolio career, again, that suits me down to the ground. So I think I've learnt at some cost that I can never kind of go and work for a big company or work in an office.
How did your relationship with authority change when you were a sitting MP?
Well, that is interesting. I don't think it changed that much because, as I say, I was very much my own boss. Now, I think I learnt what one might loosely call stakeholder management. So I think I learned, first of all, you have a local association full of your party activists, all of whom have kind of strong views about politics. And by the way, I also think it makes a huge difference if you're following your passion. So politics was my passion. I really wanted to do it. I was so thrilled and excited to be selected as a candidate in a seat that I knew I was going to win at the election, that I really threw myself into it. In fact, I gave up work for 6 months to campaign full-time in what was effectively a safe Tory seat. I didn't need to, but I really wanted to do it. So the fact that I really wanted to do it made a difference. It probably meant that I worked more closely with my activists, if you like, in the sense of, if you think of it as a sort of parallel to a company. And given that your activists, although some of them were quite eccentric, were all giving up their time voluntarily, that was an extra motivation. But I sweated the small stuff. I did the boring stuff. So in that sense, that was good. In the second sense, obviously you have a relationship with your constituents. You have 70,000 employers, arguably. And again, I took that relationship extremely seriously. And I learnt very quickly how important an MP could be to people who often some people contact their MP to get their parking ticket overturned. But a lot of people contact their MP because they can't get housing, they're waiting for a really important operation, or they've had some major crisis in their lives which they can't unblock, and they need the MP to open a few doors for them. And I took that seriously, but I did it in my own style. I was very, very informal. I made it my mission to reply to constituents immediately, even if it was just one sentence. So I'd often reply with just one sentence saying, I'll sort this out for you. And people really appreciated that. They liked hearing direct from their MP, and they liked you replying very quickly. And I was taught that by another MP who had this perhaps inappropriate phrase, speed kills. And he would recount how constituents would come up to him and say, thank you so much for replying so quickly. I wrote to you 6 months ago and you replied immediately. And he would say to them, what were you contacting me about? And they would say, I can't remember, but all I remember is that you replied very quickly. So it really meant a lot to people to be able to be in direct contact with their MP. And this was obviously in the days when email was getting going. So that was fun. But I don't think I guess looking back, I didn't have a particular relationship with authority within the House of Commons. Most of my whips would complain about me and say the whips are the people who keep MPs in line, make sure they vote, and they would complain that having me as it's called a flock, the group of MPs that a whip looks after. They would complain that having me in their flock was a real pain and that I was uncontrollable. And I was also complacent because I had a very good relationship with David Cameron. He gave me the job I wanted, which I loved, which was being the culture minister. I never wanted any other job as a minister. It's privilege enough to be a minister anyway. But I certainly didn't do the hard yards in terms of sucking up to everybody else who mattered, who would make a difference to your political career. So in that sense, yes, my relationship with authority in terms of the conventional hierarchy that exists in Parliament was pretty non-existent.
Business is more unpredictable than ever, and everyone is navigating uncharted territory with varying degrees of success. Are you still looking sideways to see what your competitors are doing, instead of outlining a vision your people can get behind? Do you want to make decisions effectively? Are you confident the right questions are being asked? Do you know how to find the clarity you're seeking? If you're in a high-stakes situation and want to unearth new, positive, and enduring outcomes, get in touch with the Wayfinders Group today. Chart the uncharted. Make a difference.
In order to get to the bar and then through work in public relations and obviously to become an MP, you have to be good with people. And it sounds like people really matter to you. When did you first realize that you wanted to have a career in politics?
I was very political from a very young age. In fact, although I got elected when I was about 36 and selected when I was about 33, 34, part of me feels kind of almost what took you so long. You know, why did I go to the bar? I went to the bar because I wanted to have a proper career behind me, which was a mistake. But I was good at debating at school. I mean, I know that sounds absolutely frivolous. The reason I was good was because I liked arguing about things and I was interested in the world and, you know, what was going on in the world and what mattered. And my father was in politics. He was a university academic, but he was very involved in the political world. So I grew up around politics. Politics mattered. My father changed parties. He went from Labour to Conservative, so it's quite a big deal when he changed parties because he was quite prominent in sort of political circles. So I grew up thinking politics mattered. I grew up being interested in politics. I grew up wanting to be in politics. I went to work in politics when I left university. In fact, I worked at for the Tory party, which was a great job. That was a job where I learned to work. Again, it suited me because, you know, you were given a policy area to look after like education and you could basically get on with it. You'd work with ministers, you'd work with individual MPs, but you were in charge of that area for the party. So I worked in politics really from I was politically active at university. I worked in politics when I left university. It was always something I was interested in from probably 10 or 11.
You've spoken about a huge number of people who have challenged you at every turn and in some ways perhaps tried to hamper your career. Who has elevated you other than David Cameron and enabled you to be successful?
It's a really good question. I often think when I read those kind of interviews in newspapers, who was your hero? Who was your mentor? I don't think I ever had a mentor, and I find that in some ways slightly depressing. My dad died when I was 16, and in many ways I followed the careers of my parents because my father, as I say, was involved in politics and my mother was involved in the world of the arts. So I always say that my mentors, in inverted commas, were my parents because I basically followed their careers. But my dad wasn't around, from the age of 16. So to a certain extent, I created a myth about my father and have in many ways tried to almost recreate the life that he had. Deeply, deeply Freudian, complex issues there going on there. And also to enter the world that my mother was part of, and become almost like her peer. But I can't think of anyone, and I slightly regret this in many ways, and partly because I didn't have a father. Although I had, obviously, I'm not complaining in that sense. I was born with enormous privileges and connections, but I never had anyone in my 20s who was an older person who would say, let's go out for a meal and I'll tell you about how the world works, or come and talk to me about your career and what's going wrong and what's going right. So I had to, although it was in a slightly rarefied world and an elite and establishment world, I still had to sort of navigate my way around. I had to work out, when I made the decision to stop working at the Tory party in my early 20s and go and become a barrister, that was very much my decision. And there was no one there saying, is this the right decision or the wrong decision? If you would say, this is how you get out of this fix, said, this is the way forward. And when things went wrong in my public affairs career, same thing. So I never had an older person who looked out for me, which sounds, first world problem. But I've never thought I've ever had a mentor.
I think it's quite common. I guess the challenge is that there are many people who know that they need that and don't know where to find that kind of support. How has your work in culture and in the arts helped you to focus on the needs of the next generation, or perhaps people who have had the opportunities that you have had, but have had similar struggles in terms of working in a fairly formulaic environment or in a very hierarchical situation?
I mean, I think I wouldn't call myself a mentor to other people, but I would certainly say that a few of the people who worked for me in Parliament, I can think of at least 3 people, 5 of my researchers, I would say have gone on to have careers that were influenced directly or indirectly by me. I would say that I am oddly proud of the fact that they worked for me and enjoyed it, partly because I was so hands-off that they enjoyed a degree of autonomy. But I can think of 5 researchers who've all gone on to have, pretty good careers, doing things they love, all of which are related to, I would say, some of the contacts they made while working for me, and the ability, therefore, for them to have direct relationships with people who are sort of part of my stakeholder environment. So in that sense, my work in arts and culture and tech have had a great influence. I mean, people working for the British Fashion Council, Universal Music, Sotheby's, BT, all of which would have been companies and organizations that were sort of in my orbit. And I think the confidence I gave them when they worked for me that, you learn as a young person, it takes a while to work out that even though you're vastly inexperienced, if you put the work in, the stuff you come out with is as valid as anyone who might have been in that world for 10 years. So I think they've benefited from that. So that's kind of the mentoring I've done, I would guess.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask, but with the benefit of hindsight, what one thing do you wish that you could change about your leadership style?
I think I am a real loner and a real, I don't like bosses and hierarchies. I think, I don't know, let's fast forward to when I was an MP. It's more to do with teamwork. I think the big picture, and I guess actually that is a form of leadership. So, as I'm sure you know, and it's probably a wild cliche, there are lots of people that say, great leaders are great team builders, and they are part of the team. So I think, I remember David Cameron and George Osborne saying to me that when they first became MPs, they lived in the chamber of the House of Commons and they just sat and listened to debates, saw how the place worked, got to know people, and were humble. They just got on with it. Whereas when I arrived in the House of Commons, I was kind of fully formed. I already had a media profile, etc. And so I think the leadership thing that I missed is understanding that the reason you play the game is that the game is important. And no striker gets a goal without the ball being passed to them. And I wish I'd spent more time getting to know my colleagues and understanding I was part of a bigger group, and that would have stood me in good stead, not in terms of cynical career progression, but in terms of enjoying the environment more, getting more out of it. That's probably my biggest regret about how I've approached my inverted commas leadership style.
Okay, last question. If you had to live your longest days again, what food would you choose to fuel them?
I'm a very kind of traditional foodie. And I often obviously think about my last meal on death row. And it would be something like shepherd's pie and peas with ketchup. So yeah, it'd be pretty straightforward, traditional British food, I guess. I mean, I like great restaurants, but when push comes to shove, if you said to me, this is the last meal, mate, and it's shepherd's pie and peas.
That is a good choice. Strong choice. I shouldn't ask this question when I'm hungry. I was going to say, have you been to Jeremy Clarkson's new pub yet? I bet they serve a really good shepherd's pie.
I haven't. Funny enough, I said to my wife the other day we should have gone. She said, absolutely not. But I like Jeremy Clarkson, and I think his program is amazing, and good luck to him. I mean, it's a bit OTT kind of industrial PR, but,
it's working for him.
Everyone knows that they're part of the game, and everyone gets something from it.
Not everybody wants to admit that, but I know that you're right.
I'm so sorry this was so chaotic. Very bad of me.
It's okay. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for being so candid. And it's actually been a delight to have you on The Longest Day.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leah.
You've been listening to The Longest Day, An Uncharted Way. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review? Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2024. Production copyright, The Wayfinders Group. All rights reserved.